Yeah, good morning, Rajat. Good
Good
morning.
morning. Good morning.
Rajat, I'll introduce Premjish and Dr. James Elkins.
Yes.
And Dr. Elkins,
Hi.
this is Rajat
Hi,
Kathuria. Dr. Rajat Kathuria, he is the Dean for Social Science and Humanities, of which our department is a part of. And right, and should we start, Premjish? Should we admit everyone? Yeah.
Yeah. So, have we admitted everyone, or
No, we have to admit.
yeah? Uh,
Swati, can you admit everyone, please? Yeah.
and let me know, and I will start. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the conference committee and the Department of Art and Performing Arts, Shiv Nadar University, I'm truly delighted to welcome you all to this two-day conference titled Knowledge Production and Research in Practice. It's a great pleasure to welcome so many colleagues and friends here today. And as you may have seen from our program schedule, we have 12 participants from different parts of the world. Dear friends, dear colleagues, thank you very much for taking out your time and adding to your online fatigue for a noble cause. Dear members of the audience, I'm delighted to welcome you all to our conference. Thank you so much for joining us and for sharing our interest in the themes and issues to be discussed in the next 2 days. Time and again, the open nature of the endeavor called artistic research, a research itself, some doubt that, some agree, some say it's research, some say it's not research, has confronted us with a very simple question. What exactly is artistic research? What are its main concerns? Not only had others asked us this question, but obviously so did we. It isn't easy to keep things in an undefined status. Also, it isn't easy to avoid the same familiar patterns and routines of academic discussions, which one can fall into thoughtlessly, especially in the face of the ongoing pandemic and the political turbulence across the world that demand one's time and critical social political commitment. Almost all of us gathered here are artists, curators, researchers, practitioners. We have come together to exchange experiences and ideas for the next 2 days. Allow me to also brief you about how we have structured the conference. The conference is divided into 3 sessions: research in the arts, mapping the terrain; rationalizing imagination, compatible methods, materials, and methodologies; the ecosystem of the contemporary art research. That's the final session. And we begin with the keynote speaker for each session and then move towards specific case studies, propositions, and articulations in the form of a panel. We reached here through conducting discussions with all the participants and also with experts from different parts of the world who are not present here. We hope to continue this dialogue, and this conference marks the beginning of a process, not the culmination. I would like to welcome Professor Rajat Kathuria, the Dean of School of Humanities and Social Sciences, Shiv Nadar University, to deliver the welcome note. Please.
Thank you, Premjish. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody who is here in this conference. Atul, it's such a delight once again to speak at the beginning of this conference, knowledge production and research in art practice. I see James and Danny and several others. Warm welcome to this conference, as Premjish said, which is being organized, two-day conference. We've already had a two-day conference. This is the second part of the 4-day conference that Atul and the Department of Art and Performing Art have organized in Shiv Nadar University. And, Premji has talked to you about what is expected of this conference. Let me say that, I'm delighted absolutely that Shiv Nadar University has a school of humanities and social sciences. And within that school, we have a Department of Art and Performing Art. Not many universities in India, indeed not many universities in the world, can boast of an art and performing art and an expanding department within the School of Humanities. And, we've been around for about 10 years, which is not a long time for a private university in any country, leave alone in India, where things take much longer than in other countries to happen. So SNU is a fairly young university. And I think we've been able to establish quite a vibrant community of faculty, vibrant community of students. And within that, the Department of Art and Performing Art has really has excelled. And as I said, not many universities have that. And we pride ourselves as being a multidisciplinary university and an interdisciplinary university that brings both to research and teaching interdisciplinary skills. And I, for one, was thinking, when I joined SNU, I was thinking about multidisciplinarity as an economist. I was thinking about international relations. I was thinking about sociology. I was thinking about maybe governance and public policy as being interdisciplinary to economics. And when I came here, of course, I had to disabuse myself of this notion, because I think that art and performing art have a lot to do with sustainability, have a lot to do with inclusion. And I think that's what we are grappling with in the world today. And as an economist, one wonders and one talks about these topics and looks at inclusion and sustainability. And as I said, I found my horizons of education to be expanded as a result of coming here, because having colleagues like Atul and Premjish and Adya and Meghna and several other colleagues in the art and performing art department who are also working on excellence in research. And as Premji said, who are also working on this the difference between practice and art and theory and art, and trying to bridge that gap. And also communicating through art the importance of sustainability and inclusion, especially in the Indian context, because our economy has suffered in the past, and we hope that the pandemic will provide an opportunity for us to be able to create systems which are both inclusive and sustainable. And I've been totally convinced that art and performing art is a medium through which this can be achieved. So we bring excellence to teaching, we bring excellence to research in the classroom, in this department and every other department. It's a delight to have conferences like this, because this just expands our horizons. It allows the teachers to bring in new methods, new pedagogy into the classroom for the benefit of students. And I think students are the center. I won't talk too much about the conference, but one point I do want to mention, because we need to catalyze this discussion on artistic research and knowledge production, which has gathered many scholars and practitioners to try and understand, how we can bridge the gap between art theory and art practice, and how both of these fields will coexist. I, for one, I'm an sort of imposter in this, but I think they will coexist. And there's no gainsaying the fact that, only theory will be at the forefront. You need to have, for subjects like art and performing art and knowledge production in art, you need to have both, practice, and you need to have theory as well. And students should have the opportunity to learn both, and perhaps to try and bridge the difference, if any, between the two. So it's a delight that this conference is being organized. I wish the conference complete success, as I'm sure it will, because you have excellent faculty within the university that is spearheading this conference. And I see from the guest list that we have excellent scholars and practitioners who have gathered from around the world to speak and to give keynote addresses. So it's a delight, absolutely. I'm really happy that we are organizing this within the School of Humanities and Social Sciences in Shiv Nadar University. And I wish Atul and the colleagues all the best. Thank you, Atul.
Thank you, Professor Katuria. Thank you for your warm wishes and generous encouragement, and also your constant support for this conference. I now invite Professor Atul Bhalla, Head of the Department of Art and Performing Art, to introduce the conference. Atul, please. You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you all. And thank you, Rajat, for those kind words and encouraging, and hopefully we shall live up to those standards. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. I welcome you to the session 2 for the conference, Research and Knowledge Production in Art Practice. And thank you for logging in from different time zones and different times of the day. I thank you all for being patient with us and in kind of organizing this conference. Since its inception, the Department of Art and Performing Arts at the Shiv Nadar University has attempted to emphasize interdisciplinary research to nurture rigorous and thoughtful practice within disciplines in and around the arts, and their interfaces with questions not limited to technology, politics, identity, philosophy, history, society, and culture. The department follows a philosophy that is learner-centric, in which the faculty and students are peers working together in, through, and with art, to borrow from John Berger, to the production of knowledge through collaborative means as well as through processes of persistent and layered inquiry. Also central to the department is the multidisciplinary and open-minded environment where students chart their own course of study as critical, self-reflexive artists, scholars, and practitioners. The department currently offers an MFA as a full program, which has gained recognition in a relative short time since its inception as unique amongst its peer institutions. The constellation of practices of both the students and the faculty members and the pedagogic approach has been critically and constructively engaging with ongoing debates around reconfiguring art practice and aesthetics. Furthermore, we are examining the efficacy of the socially engaged practice in the context of precarious global politics that has rendered us in a state of crisis, and most importantly, recasting the relevance of art research and in the post-pandemic world, where utilitarianism trumps imagination, as Prem just says, and I also believe. Expecting to remain in flux, we hope to offer such rigorous and reflexive programs which may shoot out of deliberations offered during these 2 days and through what we will continue to discuss heatedly over the next few months to come. This conference is our first attempt to gather internationally relevant voices to examine and extend discussions on what is artistic research and what is artistic knowledge, to borrow from Dr. Elkins' title. How could we rationalize and regulate a discipline like visual art practice? Or would we be in danger of losing the artist altogether if we do so? How do we keep the artist as post-institutional iterant, to borrow from Jivesh Bagchi? How do we frame parameters and rubrics to evaluate and judge the original contributions of artistic research, where artistic persona may already be a fiction, to borrow from Professor Alan D'Souza? How do we evaluate? How is artistic research similar and different from academic research and also artistic practice? Does not a finished work of art represent a culmination of a process of research, a manifestation of visual and or material thought? Is not a work of art then an intellectual proposition? If yes, then is not knowledge embedded within the work of art, or does the work of art merely represent knowledge? Or is the process of making of the work knowledge itself, the language of both the process and the work, to be continually wrestled with? Would then the wrestling be part of knowledge making as well? These questions, even though some of them may be answered with further questions, we hope will be plenty to take home to mull over. I welcome Dr. James Elkins, Jivesh Bagchi, Dr. Jonathan Harris, Dr. Felicity Allen, Professor Indra Pramit Ray, Professor Shifali Jain, Dr. Danny Butt, Professor Alan D'Souza, Professor Akia Anzi, Vidya Shivdas, Muniz Ahmed Shah, and Professor Premji Sachar. I would also like to warmly thank Professor Akia Anzi and Dr. Ranu Roy Chaudhary for agreeing to moderate the 2 sessions, the Vice Chancellor, Dr. Rupa Manjari Ghosh, and the Dean, Dr. Rajat Kathuria, for their continued support, and the department as a whole for making all of this very possible. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Atul. To your long list of concerns, I would also add, how could we tame the artistic research, domesticate the artistic research, and institutionalize the artistic research? That could be also a significant concern for all of us. Without taking a long time and standing between Professor Elkins and the audience, I will quickly introduce him, and we will start the keynote session soon. Thank you, Professor James Elkins, for kindly accepting the invitation and taking out your time. And I know it's very late for you there, and that's part of the disorienting time schedule which the conference has got. I'll briefly introduce the very popular James Elkins to all of you who may not need introduction from the art historic and the artistic community. But Professor Elkins is the Easy Chadbourne Chair in the Department of Art History, Theory and Criticism at the Art Institute of Chicago. And he is the head of History of Art at the University College Cork, Ireland. And he got a graduate degree in painting, then switched to art history, got another graduate degree and did the PhD in art history, which he finished in 1989, all from the University of Chicago. He is the author of many famous books such as Pictures and Tears, How to Use Your Eyes, What Painting Is, and The Strange Place of Religion in Contemporary Art, and Master Narratives and Their Discontents, all published by Routledge. Today, as Atul said, his keynote address, keynote lecture is titled as What is Artistic Research and What is Artistic Knowledge? And I'm just quoting the abstract of his talk today, so all of you get a brief idea about what the entire talk is about. And this is about practice-led PhD, and I quote Professor Elkins. The practice-led PhD, that's the studio art PhD, was begun in the UK and in Japan independently in the early 1970s. Since then, it has continued to grow, and there are now over 240 institutions worldwide that grant the degree. I think that 2011 was the last year when any one person could read everything that is published on practice-led PhDs. It is likely that no one person has visited every 1/4 of the institutions that host the degree. That overflow of information has several consequences. First, it means that there is no single source for these programs. No book or organization that has information about each program. In entire areas of the world, such as South America, no one knows the number of practice-based PhD programs. Organizations such as ELIA and SHARE are still largely based in the EU. Even within smaller countries, there is often a lack of knowledge about how many institutions grant PhDs. Second, it means that there is no global, philosophic, or conceptual discussions about these programs. These two short lectures are intended to set out some general questions that can help frame the debate. What is the difference between scientific research and artistic research? What kind of knowledge is produced by visual art, if any, unquote. Those who have, is just setting some ground rules. We will be taking questions at the end of this session, but owing to the number of people, we request everybody to type your questions in the chat box, and I will, or we will speak out. We will speak out those questions, and Professor Elkins will answer those questions later on. We have 7 more minutes, Atul. Shall we start now? Or? Okay. Okay. I invite Professor James Elkins to deliver his keynote lecture.
Okay.
Jim.
Great. Thank you very much. Yeah, no, I can use the 7 minutes. I can actually start a schedule, get a little bit ahead of the schedule for once. So I just want to say about your introduction. Thank you very much for that. I had actually forgotten that abstract, but that year 2011 is just the year, that's the year I gave up. I try to keep up with things now, but 2011 was the last year that I think that the reason I say that no one could read all literature is because in that year there were 10 books that appeared, not to mention a number of articles on this subject. So it's a pretty much a monstrous subject, or maybe a nicer way of putting it is to say it grows in different directions in different parts of the world. There is also, it might be worth saying, an open opportunity for someone or some institution to put together a book, which would be a reference work, presumably largely online, but it could be print too, a guide to these 240 odd institutions, the number of which keeps growing each year. But that's another subject. So I have 2 short lectures. They're separate lectures. I'll pop out of this one at the end and go straight into the next one. They should take maybe 15 minutes each, maybe 20 minutes for this one. And they are only intended to set out basic ideas and questions. Everything, as far as I'm concerned, in this field is open to question. So in this first of the two lectures, which is about research, the second one's about knowledge, I divided this into three subjects. First is just a couple of general things I want to say about research in an art school and how that works. That's where I teach, in an art school. And then this question that guides in some ways and even forms a lot of the discourse by being avoided, and that is the question about how much, to what degree, art research resembles scientific research. And then I think the most useful part, often ignored in the contemporary literature, is a distinction made a number of decades ago between research through art, into art, and for art. So first of all, just a little bit about research in an art school. So in some parts of the world, especially the UK and Australia, as you'll be hearing more in your conference, and in advanced art instruction in general at the MFA or MA level or beyond, research is one of the key words in art instruction. And the other is knowledge, and the principal reason for that is that the construction or definition of a new discipline in a university in any field usually involves a phrase along these lines. This new field, art discipline, however, will present a consistent methodology of research that will result in the production of new knowledge. So these two things are key to each other in the institutional literature as well as philosophically. So in institutions like these ones that I'm thinking of, art students are expected to develop research methodologies and to describe their work as research. Just to give you an example, at our institution, we use research as part of what we call Research Studio 1. This is foundation year, first year, freshman material. And so at this level, research is largely undifferentiated. There's not a lot of different categories within it. They look something like this: observe, search, record, form, and transform. It's fairly informal in comparison to what happens in a lot of other institutions around the world. Okay, so on to the main parts of these talks. That's not supposed to say number 4, but anyway, number 2. So scientific research and its relation to art research. I have a couple of fundamental points I think are worth making at the beginning of this debate, which can get quite involved. And one of them would be that scientific research usually includes a defined list of research methodologies or methods. A list of appropriate or acceptable methods is common to a number of different disciplines, the sciences and social sciences. A description of what will count as evidence, what's going to be permitted to be considered as legitimately in the field of inquiry and what isn't. And then research papers divided into conventional categories, usually called methods, materials, results, and others, conventional sections. And in the hard sciences, this is a very codified now way of writing with these headings, of which there are about a half dozen. So I think perhaps the most useful way to put this question to begin with is as a choice between 3 similar options. So first, it is claimed that artistic research can utilize scientific research methodologies, including the ones that I listed on the last screen, headings like methods, materials, results, and so on, even though it's fundamentally distinct from scientific research. Then it's also been claimed that artistic research needs to rethink scientific research because it's fundamentally distinct from scientific research. So in the first case, a number of the categories and concepts for the last screen can be adopted. In the second case, they need to be rethought or redefined. And then the third position is artistic research can't use scientific research methodology because it's fundamentally distinct from scientific research. And this is, of course, completely schematic, but useful, I think, because these discussions get amazingly entangled with the adjustments that are proposed to some of those categories, like I showed you on the last screen. Here's the same idea in a diagram, which is taken from a book that's still one of the largest in this field, called The Routledge Companion to Research in the Arts. It's still a good reference work, this one. The authors of the particular article from which I took this make a very similar distinction. Artistic research is fundamentally different from other fields. It would be more or less the claim that's implied by the top, where you have 2 overlapping ellipses, and one of them represents art and the other one science in the field of research. And then you can consider various hybrids, which would be in the middle, or a complete synthesis has also been proposed by several people. So just to give you an example of the idea that artistic research can't use scientific research, this is Soren Kierup, who's written, "There is no scientific research to which artistic research might have to comply. Artistic research should be left alone to develop its own methods." So this has led in the literature to this question about whether or not artistic research should be defined. Is there something fundamentally misguided about the idea that there should be a concerted effort to define it? So maybe it should be defined, because otherwise it wouldn't make sense to call it research. But on the other hand, maybe it shouldn't, because art has an intrinsic openness. Depending on who you read for this, you might learn that it's either said to be the result of its visual nature, in other words, art is outside of language, that set of claims, or of its freedom, its political and cultural freedom within institutions. So I give you an example of the kinds of discussions that this has led to. There's a really interesting little book by Henk Slager, who teaches in Utrecht in the Netherlands, called The Pleasure of Research, which I think you can get online. I think it's a free PDF. A very good example of the second of those two ideas. So research, he says, has, quote, "no need to be led by the formatted models of the established scientific order." That'd be his starting point. This will be a form of research not swayed by issues dictated by the late capitalist free market system or its knowledge commodification. This will be an authentic research that comes about through an artistic necessity. So with this kind of position, there is the question of the autonomy of the artist, and not only within the domain of artistic production, but within the institution, because if you abjure the responsibility to make definitions or at least comparisons, then you can end up with in an incomparable position. In other words, you can't talk to your colleagues in physics, for example, because they wouldn't be able to see points of comparison. There's Henk Slager there. So I'll show you a little bit more about the way that he reasons this. He says, "Many artistic research projects seem to thwart the well-defined disciplines. They know the hermeneutic questions of the humanities, the alpha sciences. They are engaged in empirically scientific methods, the beta sciences, and they are aware of commitment, the gamma sciences. Artistic research," Henk says, "points to a, quote, delta science, characterized by a, quote, capacity to continuously engage in novel, unexpected epistemological relations in a methodological process of interconnectivity." So you can see the gesturing here, the rhetoric is toward institutional and political freedom, and he, like some others who have written on this subject, like to say that enclaves within universities, and especially in art academies, independent institutions like art academies and art schools, are optimal places of freedom for this kind of work. The rhetoric like this becomes more problematic when you're talking about departments in universities, because then comes the question of how you talk to your colleagues around the table and compare what you're calling research to what they're calling research. So those kinds of questions of community come to bear on that. The last part of this is these three very useful prepositions that were invented by Christopher Frayling, Sir Christopher Frayling. He's one of the early writers on this subject. He started writing on it back in the 70s when these programs were first starting in the UK. So as I said, this is not something that tends to be cited, I think, as much now as it used to be, but it's also a really useful way of presenting these problems schematically. So he proposed several different ways of thinking about what art research might mean. He's developed his ideas by elaborating on some concepts that were proposed by Herbert Reed, an earlier English critic. So I have a table of these here. Down the left column, you can see the form of research identified by the preposition for research to art, research through art, research into art, research for art. And then I just thought, since this is a table of prepositions, I just add one that no one uses, research in art. So Herbert Reed has a couple of had a couple of definitions about research to art and through art, but I'm not going to talk about those because I wanted just to show the correlation, but to concentrate on what Christopher Frayling wrote. So over in the right column, in the second row there, under research through art, he says this is the first kind of artistic research, is research in the field of art and design. He calls it uppercase research or systematic inquiry. For example, art that's used to educate people, including documentaries and infographics, things like that. So the utilitarian or teleological or pragmatic uses of art for those purposes. The second would be research into art, and in that category he includes art history and perhaps aesthetics. I'm not sure why he put some perhaps in there, but at any rate, that would include art theory and art history and so on. And then the one that concerns us is the remaining preposition for art, research for art. And that he defines as research leading to the production of art so that the art embodies the thinking. And he says that's lowercase research, non-professional searching. So if I look at that in a little bit more detail, I think you can break this down into 3 claims. So this is an expansion of his idea of research for art. So one way that you might think of that is research that leads to the production of art. If it's only that, though, then that would be unproblematic. It would just make this category the same as research through art, uppercase research. Another way of reading his definition of research for art would be that it's research that leads to art that embodies the research. And this is the central problematic possibility. And I have more to say about this on the next slide. It's also possible to read what he said as lowercase research or searching. And that would imply that the research is free of strict research methodology. But then, of course, it leaves it open how you might characterize that kind of lowercase research. So drilling into these categories, I think you end up with this enigmatic one, which requires a strangely used verb, embodiment. So since the 1970s, people have been trying to understand what research for art means. If your research is embodied in the art you make, then you can ask, what's the difference between the research itself, all the internet searches or notes or objects you've collected, and the artwork that you produce? Embodiment could be identification, in other words. So in science, research produces knowledge, but this raises the question of whether or not the artwork itself is a kind of knowledge. So I don't think this is the kind of, I don't think that this classification is a way to resolve this problem. It just clarifies it by focusing the spotlight on this one problematic aspect and showing that there are a lot of, in a kind of halo effect, there are a lot of ideas around this that he was also interested in, but which are not difficult actually to define. So I'm going to pop out of that one and go straight into the second one, which follows from this. So the second of these two terms, this question of artistic knowledge, problem that logically follows immediately from that. And here I've divided this into, actually I'm going to do the first 3. I'm not going to do the last one. So the first question is the artwork knowledge? The question that I was broaching there a second ago. And then I'm going to go through a list of 6 different kinds of knowledge that was very helpfully assembled by a philosopher who came to a conference that we did in Chicago some years ago called What Do Artists Know? An epistemologist helped us out with this little provisional list of kinds of knowledge. Seems to me also a very useful thing to have, even though it's expandable and it's debatable and so on. And then I want to end with this third category here of words that can be used instead of knowledge. Because these 2 words, research and knowledge, have now been used in the literature in the practice-led PhD since the early 70s. And that means, depending on how you count generations, I guess 2 generations of scholars have grown up with these words naturalized in the curriculum and in their own practices. But there have been, historically, any number of synonyms and alternate terms that could be used. And so it seems to me an interesting thing to bear in mind also in the case of research, that there are other words like inquiry and so on that could be used. And I'm going to skip that last category, as I said. So first of all, that question, is artwork knowledge? Is the work that you produce as a visual artist in such a program of study, is it knowledge? So if visual art involves research, then it should produce some form of knowledge. So research in physics produces knowledge of matter, research in social sciences produces knowledge of culture. Then if you put the question in that form, you could ask what kind of knowledge visual art produces. Does it have its own, does it have a sort of art, a classification of knowledge, sorry, that it produces? And is it a special kind of knowledge because it's visual, or because it is embodied by the visual, or because it comes out of the visual? Does it have a category of its own? Could it have a category of its own? So I have a couple of concrete examples, just so this doesn't stay completely abstract. This is Fred Wilson. I have a couple of references in here to other lectures that I'm going to be doing here today that branch off from this topic. So Fred Wilson, a contemporary artist, he's built his practice on being invited by museums to look through their archives, and he researches their history, especially their political history and their relation to race and class, and he brings out things that they've kept in storage, and he designs exhibitions that reveal the politics and the history involved. And this is one of his exhibitions where he took what are called dime store Indians that used to stand outside of pharmacies and arranged them in the collection of the Maryland Historical Society. Mark Dion is another contemporary artist whose work is often said to produce knowledge. He redisplays objects in museums by putting them into new configurations in order to bring out different meanings. And he also does independent projects. Like this is a detail from a project he did called Thames Dig, in which he got a number of volunteers to pick up objects from the bank of the Thames in London is very muddy, and they went slogging around there and picked up all the rubbish, and then they arranged them in elaborate Victorian museum display cabinets in this way. So in both of these cases, knowledge is intended to be produced by the art object, but is not embodied in the art object in the sense that the knowledge is discursive. It comes from discussing what happens in these artworks after the fact. In the case of Mark Dion, those sorts of discussions have often turned to the unacknowledged complicity of the institutions in question with racism and with all issues of their sources of funding and things like that. That's in the case of Fred Wilson. In the case of Mark Dion, these displays are not meant to produce usable, pragmatic knowledge about what things that people have been throwing over the embankments of the Thames or have been floating down the Thames River. It's more like the idea of showing conventional forms of display with unconventional content, because that is meant to create a questioning, an awareness and a questioning of the forms of museological display in general. So in Wilson's case, the knowledge can be put in words. You could say something like, this museum has ignored African diaspora, or this museum has made the ethnicity of its security staff invisible. Those are sort of claims he's made. So the artwork itself is in fact not part of that knowledge. It's evidence that leads to that knowledge. So the knowledge doesn't take the form of the visual objects, which of course begs that question of the nature of the visual and why those things had to be visual in order to create those kinds of knowledge, because they actually suggest or imply the kinds of inquiries that should be done in those institutions. So the visual objects themselves, once they've been interpreted, have another and again problematic status. In the case of Mark Dion, very few writers have said whether or not the work of art just in general, very few writers have said of this kind of work, whether or not it is knowledge or it embodies knowledge. If the work is knowledge, that means that the visual qualities of the art are themselves a form of knowledge. So Mark Dion's installations and arrangements and cabinets and things like that are close to that, because he's interested in showing visual arrangements and thinking and hoping by analogy that questions can be raised about arrangements that are similar but have different subject matter. If your work embodies knowledge, that means, from a student's point of view, that your instructors are going to work with you to articulate the information in your artwork So the course of your education will involve increasing your capacity to be articulate about knowledge which is embodied or embedded, somehow encoded in the artwork itself, but the objects you create themselves would not be a form of knowledge. If you to pursue this, which I'm not going to do right here, then the question often leads to questions of form. Because there's the idea of a form of knowledge is not always metaphorical, but the idea of a form of an artwork is almost always initially literal. Okay, and then I thought it might be also of interest to show you some of the results of this conference in which we called What Do Artists Know?, in which we tried to parse different kinds of knowledge in order to try to make some headway on this question of the sort of knowledge that's produced by visual art, or the sort of knowledge that applies to visual art or is appropriate to visual art. So here's the list of 6. The first one is tacit knowledge. So tacit knowledge in the ordinary usage means it's things that you don't quite know yet, but you may be able to know or to describe soon. You may be able to articulate them soon. This expression was popularized by Michael Polanyi, who was a philosopher of science. He was mostly interested in the fact that scientists in laboratories often, in his account, don't often know exactly what they're doing. There is a kind of a notional schematic stereotype of scientists that they sit down and think of a theory and then think of an experiment and figure out what counts as evidence and so on, and then just go into the lab and perform everything. But Polanyi's and other sociologists and philosophers of science in the 60s and 70s were first noticing that that's not actually the way most science happens. So tacit knowledge is important, he said, in science because it can account for a lot of the behavior and the construction of a lab and the ways that things happen in the lab before the hypothesis, the testable, articulable, publishable hypothesis is actually said or is something that can be put down on paper. So I was at our conference, we were applying that to art, but it was that's something that was formed as an hypothesis in science. And just to say one more thing about that, I'm sorry, I switched screens a little bit too fast there. That it's a very common thing in art studios to have artists say, "I'm sorry, I can't really explain my work yet. You know, I'm very close to it. I just made it." Tacit knowledge is much more widely acknowledged as an experiential fact of the studio. But the pedagogy, especially at the third level, when you get to these PhDs and practice-led PhDs, the pedagogy is all bent toward articulation, and that is to say, the minimization or the bounding of those moments or of those periods of tacit knowledge in favor of a space of clarity and articulation and language. So tacit knowledge is actually fairly easy to see how it can apply to visual arts. The problematic part of it is the more articulated part. That's where the visual comes into question and the nature of its relation to knowledge. Whereas in science, the tacit knowledge has only relatively recently become part of the routine self-understanding of science because everything was on the other side. That is to say, knowledge that was no longer tacit. So visual knowledge. If visual art has a kind of knowledge that pertains to it and to it alone, then that knowledge might well be called visual. Then the question is, do shapes and textures and so on, all the formal properties of artworks as they appear to us, actually tell us anything? Is knowledge actually the right word for what happens when we look at art, especially if you think of this in terms of a formal analysis before you're doing things like reading a symbolic narrative or something like in the painting in that photograph. But when you're thinking of something as a visual object in your visual field, is it inappropriate? Is it counterintuitive? Is it misguided to call things like colors forms of knowledge? If in order for this expression, visual knowledge, not to be ultimately self-contradictory, there has to be some way of defending that particular claim, and some people do. And there have been people who take this position that the only genuinely, legitimately visual form of knowledge is, in fact, the sum total of things that are usually inventoried under the heading of formal analysis. But at any rate, it begs that question in an interesting way and has resulted in some curious writing by people like Roland Barthes and others who have tried to imagine what it's like if you look at a work of visual art and don't think of any of the symbols or the narratives or the social implications and context that you know apply to it, and try to look at it just as a visual object. Where are you then? You're in the realm of what Roland Barthes called the uncoded image, a realm where you're actually, logically speaking, not allowed to speak. You're only allowed to appreciate. You can ooh and ah or something, but language is taken from you at that point. So it produces an odd effect thinking this way. It disrupts ordinary ways of appreciating and visual objects. Okay, the third is affective knowledge. So in some accounts, visual art is mainly concerned with emotions and feelings and moods, other affective states. And then if you think of things that way, then your form of knowledge appropriate to art could be called affective. The problem here is that affect, of course, is nonverbal. In affect theory, as has been promulgated by people like Brian Masumi, affect is by definition nonverbal and uncognized. It's somatic. It's a nearly instantaneous somatic embodied relation to the world. So it can't be knowledge in the ordinary senses of that word. It would stretch. Affective knowledge stretches the plausible meanings of knowledge. Even though in ordinary life we do talk about people having emotional wisdom and so on, things like that. And there's more material on that, which is not in this lecture. So affective knowledge, though, does respond well to, I think, a fair number of people's idea of the difference between visual art and other arts, and that is that it seems to have to do with things like feelings and emotions and moods somehow. So if it were also to have to do with knowledge, this would be the bridge between visual art and knowledge. I saved to the fourth in this list the one that is the default definition if you look in dictionaries and use it and especially in the sciences, and that is knowledge is propositional. This is the most common definition of knowledge. So in this way of thinking of things, knowledge is logical statements in language. That is anything that is a well-formed proposition as a sentence. Also, there's symbolic logic. So knowledge can also be articulated in terms of logic symbols, combinatoric symbols in set theory and so on, or in mathematics like I have in the bottom there. So in the broadest way of understanding this would be knowledge would be anything that makes sense. Logically speaking, outside propositional knowledge, there's only nonsense. So if you're a logician, you're thinking about this problem from that point of view, then my numbers 1 through 3 and the next two that I have are all more or less misguided, or at least extensions of, or perhaps just new meanings assigned to the word knowledge, because knowledge actually is logic or is propositions. That's a still from the science fiction movie from the 50s, in which a genius alien shows a logic that no human can possibly understand. 5 is practical knowledge. So this was a nice contribution by this in this group that we did, the What Do Artists Know group by our epistemologist. Practical knowledge is something you know how to do, but you can't put it in words. So like playing the piano or riding the bicycle, things like that. And of course, painting, any kind of acquired skill becomes a kind of practical knowledge because the habit, as has been theorized since the 19th century, that habit is something that becomes, of which the person becomes unaware. So even if you could have explained how you played the piano badly when you were 5 years old or something, you can no longer explain it. It becomes practical knowledge. And this is also a very common experience of artists, of course, or anyone who works in a standard enough fashion so that they have repeated something long enough so that they have motor skills and so on. But it's problematic when it's used in this context, because if practical knowledge is going to be the idea of the kind of knowledge that's appropriate to art, then it becomes very difficult to fit it into pedagogic curricula in which research produces this kind of knowledge, simply because you wouldn't be able to write a dissertation. You wouldn't be able to write your thesis at the end of your PhD about it. And last, phenomenal knowledge. This is things you've experienced that have an intensity in your memory but they can't be put fully in words. So then thinking of immersive experiences of all different sorts, whatever they are, swimming, mountain climbing, anything like that. Phenomenal knowledge, meaning plenary immersive experiences, which you think of as knowledge. You have a stock of knowledge of these experiences, but they're not things that you could put in words. It wasn't my best example here using a mountain climber, because that makes it seem a little bit like a skill, a little bit like the last one. But so a better example would just be something like being out in a ferocious rainstorm, something like that, that's completely immersive, and you know that you experienced it and you feel it as knowledge. Same kind of thing, but you can't put it in words. Same kind of thing, of course, often happens in artworks, and not just installations and immersive artworks and like films and so on, but in any artwork this can often happen. The phenomenal knowledge of the piece exceeds verbal descriptions of it and published accounts. That's a commonplace problem in art, in the history of art. Okay, so that was the 6 in the list that we came up with. Obviously, easy to extend this or collapse a couple of these. So it's not clear if any of these are the right word for what happens in visual art. 2 is literally the one which names visual art, but it's not especially unclear about how that might be denominated as knowledge. The 3rd one, affective, it seems a little bit too logical, a little bit more like science or criticism is the 4th one as well. So from an artist's point of view, you can ask yourself if any of these fit your production. From an administrator's or an instructor's point of view, you can ask which of these are teachable, which of them are quantifiable and accessible outcomes, learning outcomes or learning goals. So you'd have several different ways of approaching this question of what's appropriate. Okay, and I'm going to end, this is the end of both of these lectures, just with a few alternatives, words that could be used instead of knowledge. Same kind of thing could be done with research. So there are some alternatives. For example, understanding. Instead of saying your work produces or the student's work should produce knowledge, you could say it should produce understanding. And here you have a good source readily available. That's the German philosopher Wilhelm Dilthey, who made an influential distinction between understanding and explanation. So the one of them pertains to the human sciences and the other pertains to the hard sciences. Understanding, in his account, is what the arts do, because visual art doesn't explain anything. It only helps us to understand things. There's a lineage that leads from Dilthey up to people like Susan Sontag and theorists of the inherent meaninglessness of the visual. That is to say that visual. This is one of Susan Sontag's positions, that visual images can tell you that they're important, but they can't tell you what to think about them. They can't tell you if they're good or bad or what they mean. Expression is another word with a long philosophic history that could be used instead of knowledge. And here one of the sources might be the English philosopher Robin Collingwood, who developed a theory of expression by defining it as part of self-reflexivity or introspection or awareness and individuation, the development of a unique personality and viewpoint. This literature, like Dilthey's, wouldn't be immediately usable from an administrative point of view, but it could be easily brought into a broader conversation that could result in a pedagogic program. So from Collingwood's point of view, this is what art should do. Expressiveness should help people become more aware and more fully themselves. And meaning. So meaning may be the broadest and oldest of these terms. There's a very interesting source here too, and that's the contemporary German art theorist Gottfried Böhm, who's spent his career exploring this possibility that art may produce not knowledge but meaning. He likes to say that images, paintings are his usual example, that images are a combination of the purely visual and the linguistic, but not the kind of combination that can be separated, not like an oil and vinegar combination, oil and water combination, but something fused. He calls it the iconic logos, the image/word. So that's a deliberate contradiction in terms. An object that's constituted that way can't tell us anything directly, like in language. We understand that it has meaning, even if we can't say what it's telling us. So this has led to a whole literature in art history and art theory about the idea that images can think, or that they make you think about thinking, or that they make you think about reading, even though you don't know exactly what they're telling you. This is it's an anti-semiotic idea, a way of thinking about images as things that are in between language and something that would be purely visual. Okay, so like I say, these are only just ideas. What I would like to just stop there in order to have plenty of time to talk about those things. I am only hoping here that this might have some resonance for some of you guys over the next couple of days, because from my point of view, these are all unsolved questions, from A to Z unsolved.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks a lot, and thank you for presenting this complex survey of insights and perspectives on artistic research and artistic knowledge, or what kind of knowledge it produces, and also carefully categorizing it into various forms of knowledge, which I'm sure will be very helpful for us in the coming days to discuss. And I think there are already hands raised. Before I allow some questions, I will also act selfish as the moderator. I will go first, but before that, I would like to announce that those who would like to ask questions, those who have comments, please write it in the chat box, and we will share that with Professor Elkins here, and we will take up that for discussion. Professor Katuria, please go ahead. I think you have something to share.
Thanks. I was going to type it out, as you said.
No.
Thanks for letting me ask this question. Thank you, Professor Elkins, for a fascinating lecture, especially to somebody who's outside of the the field. And this is something I'm asking for purely selfish reasons, because we are going through this sort of quo vadis exercise within the university. Where are we headed? What the vision is? And art is pretty much a part of our vision going forward. And we're trying to also sort of define what research means and try to quantify it. How many journal articles are produced, and, how many citations, whether it's in a book or whether it's in a journal, and what is the ranking of that journal. That entire exercise that universities do, we're doing that. So I wanted to ask you, it may sound as a naive question, and forgive the naivety of the question. Why is there so much emphasis being put in your field on sort of conforming to the scientific standards of what is defined as research?
Yeah. That's a tough one to answer. That's a tough one to answer quickly. It depends very much on the institution. So the departments that teach art at higher levels, college, third level, that are in large research universities will often face the pressure, as I was trying to say, but a little bit too quickly, throwing the pressure of the hierarchy of their institution to remain, in the broadest sense, collegial, to remain comparative. So from the point of view of assessment and accreditation, departments have to be comparable across the board and with other departments. So the more departments there are in the institution that follow the usual conventional hard science and social science norms of research, the more the art departments tend to have to pay attention to that. On the other hand, the smaller the institution, or the more independent the institution, like the one that Henk Slager in Utrecht works in, the more independent they can get, to the point where Henk, that person, can write practically anything he wants because I've talked about him in other lectures at more length, and I've gotten a lot of people scratching their heads, because he really doesn't mind if he moves out of the generally comprehensible in the name of freedom of inquiry and things like that. But since you asked this question, and since this maybe this would be the best time to say, I like to always say, there's a huge opportunity for institutions that are just starting these programs to define these things independently. These 240 odd programs are curiously similar All the ones that I've had contact with have points of similarity and sometimes very strongly similar. The UK is the major model, but these programs also started simultaneously and independently in Japan in the 70s, and Japan has 26 of these PhD granting art institutions in Japan. So there are other traditions, and there are regional variants. There are 5 or 6, I think, different strains of this. But by and large, if you were a prospective student and you were looking around for an institution to study in, you'd be very hard pressed to find the standout institution that would clearly define a different position. So you have I think there's a huge opportunity waiting for an institution that's willing to come to some consensus definition that's not the normative ones. I hope you guys could do it. I think it would be great.
Thanks,
Yeah.
James. Thanks. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Katuria. Jim, I was thinking that knowledge should not be understood as, from your presentation, what is very evident is that knowledge should not be understood as an essentially fixed phenomenon. And we must first broach the essential and yet complex definition of knowledge in its geopolitical, historical, social, and economic condition, and to also analyze how Eurocentric attitudes have affected Western academies' ways of distinguishing the land of knowledge from the land of storytelling, which I feel is very important. Coming to one important question, which we all are bothered about and which often comes to discussion, is this demand to define methods in artistic research and engaging in methodologies to theorize and reflect on these methods. And Erin Manning has said that disciplines still order knowledge according to specific understanding of what constitute the methods, and also sometimes, and what constitutes the perfect method. And sometimes disciplines also police these methods through peer reviews and institutional reviews. So is this call for methods, is this formalizing methods in the artistic research a process of normalization, a process of institutionalization? Where do you stand on this? What do you think about this call for methods and imposing methods?
Yeah, where I stand on these things is almost always way off to one side of the current debates, because happily I'm not in administration and I'm not in an institution that gives these PhDs. So I have the luxury of having somewhat radical positions on this. I do understand the necessity in larger institutions to have standards that are comparable across fields and so on, and across years, and so that what are called in general in institutions things like learning outcomes and goals have their close equivalents in the practice-led PhD in the definition of methods, learning methodologies, and also criteria for argument, for evidence, for what counts as the archive, what counts as a conclusion, that sort of thing. The main issue that I have with the whole thing, if I were to imagine for a moment that there aren't institutional constraints, that this is really only about educating artists and making better art. The main problem I would have is that it's not the case that most artists through most of history have thought of what they do as research. It's actually only a tiny percentage of artists that have thought that way. And almost all of those artists are alive now, to put it baldly. So you have a disconnect between large masses of art production, and I'm not at all excluding postmodernism and modernism in saying this. This is not just a modern / pre-modern kind of a distinction. So the question is, for these practice-led programs at the MA and the PhD level, it would be very useful, I would think, if they would theorize what kinds of art practice are not appropriate for their programs. In what cases, in what styles, in what places, in what times and periods have artists not thought of their art as research, And in that case, where might they go for their education, or how might they think differently? So it's more a matter just of acknowledging the fact that this is a relatively recent phenomenon that's come to seem natural and universal because of our pedagogic system. The counter argument there is that this is quite widespread. So you can't get very far in art education anywhere in the world without running into versions of this. The next stage in that claim would be to say that this kind of programs reflect the age that we're in. But that can't be the whole story, because administration drives these categories forward in a clearly comprehensible way. So if you don't mind, I would just like to take 30 seconds and tell a story which to me really encapsulates this. I was on a board. I was on a board in a Canadian university that was setting up their PhD, and we were talking about research and consistent research methodologies. And I said, but lots of people don't have consistent research methodologies. So I was making this general point, and one of the faculty members said, no, I think you're wrong. Artists do. And I said, well, Mondrian, for example, he didn't have a research methodology. And the answer that I was given was, the reason that Mondrian didn't have a consistent research methodology, the reason that Mondrian's work was not research producing knowledge is that he didn't possess a consistent research methodology. So that answer was astonishing to me, because it showed me how that faculty member had never questioned the idea that at its optimal point of articulation, all artist practices can be described as research methodologies. That shows to be a kind of a dangerous naturalization of the idea. So that's my skeptical rant about that.
This also brings me to the next question in the decolonial context. There are, like the way you delineated the forms of knowledge and the ways of doing artistic research, there are also forms of knowledge and or forms of research which the academy does not deserve, or which does not have to be part of the academy. Is artistic research such a form of knowledge too, that it doesn't have to be in the academy, or it always stands in opposition to the institutionalized and established ways of doing research, or it could be introduced as a Trojan horse into the academy.
Yeah. No, definitely there are. I can think of artists. I'm thinking at the moment, I'm thinking especially of writers with complicated research agendas that work outside of the academy. Absolutely. That in institutions that require that have a highly articulated structure of requirements, that is to say, every module or every term, the student has to come up with a new form of research and archive. I'm thinking of things like places like University of Reading in the UK does this. Some Scandinavian institutions do this. In institutions like that, if you're the kind of artist who needs guidance periodically and reframing of their project, then institutions could be very beneficial. That the kind of research that gets done outside an institution would be, in theory, much freer to not have those constraints. But it's not so much that issue of like a person wanting to apply and wondering if their form of research doesn't fit with an institution. The issue that I find more common is that the student who is thinking of applying to these programs writes a description of their work as research in order to get into the programs. So they're thinking they're asked to think of their work as research in order to actually apply.
There's a question from Dr. Ranu Roy Chaudhary. Thanks, Professor Elkins. Thank you so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. I have two questions. So I'll ask the first one. I wondered if you could reflect a little more on the difference between research into art and research in art. I understand that you discussed these two in context of Herbert Reed and Freiling's articulations at different historically specific moments, and that you deliberately put question marks in your schematic table, except Freiling's categorization of art history as research into art. Could you talk a bit on those question marks you put? That's the first question.
Yeah, I mean, I could. It depends on exactly what kind of thing. Oops, I'm sorry. Wait a second. I just did something to my. I just wanted to share that screen again. It depends on where you want to go with this. Here's that screen again. It would depend on where you would want to go with this, though. So I only put this in for fun because I noticed when I was reading this that no one had used this in art. But I think it's perfectly normal to say that you're doing research in art if you're, for example, an art historian. I wouldn't mind that. I just think of this as an open possibility. Someone could create something in that space. But I think the self-description of art history would be more likely, at least using in North American English, I would probably want to say I'm doing research in art. I probably wouldn't want to say into art. So maybe this should be flipped. But I'm more intrigued by the possibility that you might be able to do something different with that other category. I may not have answered the question because you could go in different directions with that question. Sorry.
The second part of the question is, I understand that your 6-tier categorization of knowledge, or the alternative conceptual grids like understanding and expression, comes from specific intellectual traditions, and I'm curious about the universal applicability of what might count as knowledge or its equivalent across time and space, and how might we account for subject positions and institutional geopolitical locations of artists and researchers?
Yeah, that's a really fabulous question. I have so now I would really like to ask a question of some of you there might be able to answer this for me. I have a book in my library which seems to me to be about 3,000 pages long. It's probably only about 1,000, but seems unreadable. It's called Indian Logic: Histories of Indian Logic. So even within that category of propositional logic, you would definitely be able to do culturally relative rereadings of that, even within that. And then if you get outside that into affect, of course, you have all kinds of translation possibilities. So far, I'm not aware of work that's been done in that realm, but there's a huge amount that could be done. And even within, so just to stay within that narrowest of all categories, where knowledge is propositional knowledge or logic. There's also been some great work done by people like, there's a woman named Susan Hack, H-A-A-C-K, Susan Hack, who wrote a book called Deviant Logics, non-Aristotelian logic. And that's just there. And then if you step out from that into affective logic, you have all kinds of different theories of the role of affect, or if you want to say a passion or emotion, in different cultures and different languages. So I think it would be spectacular to have someone theorize a more culturally specific or historically constrained form of one of those, or just define a different one altogether. These things are all problematics that arise from, and some of them are, you might say, pseudo problems. They arise from the ways that people have talked about art in post-structuralism in general. Like I was saying with the Roland Barthes, you back yourself into a corner if you think of art, visual art, as a semiotic object, for example, that has a code, which you can then strip away to some supposedly luminous, wordless kind of a background. So this would be also a great subject for a conference if it were constrained in a helpful way. Like you couldn't do all 6 forms of logic that way, but maybe 1 or 2 of them.
Yeah, Atul, maybe you could think about the next conference from this. Shumantra, you have a question? Your hand is raised.
Yes, kind of, James, fantastic talk you have given, but this question could be a naive question from my side, but being born and brought up in India, and specifically my story in a sense, I think most of us brought up with a system and knowledge which may be called self-knowledge. Now this self-knowledge, whether sometimes it goes to religion or spiritual in the Indian context. For example, from my childhood, I was born and brought up to Rabindranath Tagore's music or its writing, or my father was a philosopher, so the understanding of self, or the introduction to the word called self, I remember, came from a book from my father's collection of Kierkegaard's, one book called Self. Now, this question of self, I understand it's a philosophical area, and I don't know, in your categorization of knowledges, is this self-knowledge whether you at all give it a place, or it will come under affect?
I love this question, because this is an infinite question. It's the best kind of question. I think there are two things maybe possibly helpful to say there. First of all, one of the things we're developing in our institution, we're trying to get our students away from the idea that they should only do proper kinds of research. In other words, you research academic journals that are in your institution's library, behave yourself well as a scholar. We're trying to get them away from that. And we started calling that red research. And we distinguish red research from two other kinds of research. Green research is what artists do when they're just looking for their own whatever they're doing. So they're searching the internet and finding crazy things, and they're hanging out on social media, and they're looking at anime and manga or whatever they're looking at. Green research is whatever an artist does without any constraints, entirely on their own for themselves. Blue research is close to what you were saying. Blue research is what you do when you're not actually looking outside yourself. Blue research is introspection. Blue research is anything inward, inwardness, self-awareness, sense of the self. And under blue research, we also include things like if you what are called entoptic phenomena. If you press on your eyelids, you see lights. Anything that comes from inside you is blue research. And we encourage the students to think about red, green, and blue research all together. That's the one thing that occurred to me. The other one, though, is that there is a link between what you're saying and one of the central problems, I think, of third-level education in the arts, which I haven't had a chance to mention yet, and that is that the more years as an artist you spend in an institution learning art, the more you're going to be taught to articulate your art. And it's a common charge that's been brought against these PhD programs that they often result in the artist writing a 300-page thesis on their own artwork, which seems solipsistic and navel-gazing and in an unhelpful way. But the other side of that, though, is that in order to do such a thing, you have to become tremendously articulate about yourself. You can still be deeply misguided about yourself, but you have to be very, very articulate. So the crucial thing here for me is that there is no way back once you start down that road. The more years that an artist spends in an institution studying themselves and their art and its relation to theory and history, the more articulate they're going to be about more things. They're going to be, by some standards, more and more self-aware. And you can't go to the chalkboard and erase that. It keeps accumulating. It's not good for all artists. I think of an artist like Jasper Johns, for example. I don't think that he's capable of articulating most of what he does. He doesn't have any idea what he's doing half the time. And luckily, no one's forcing him to, because he's famous. So this is a problem, I think, for these institutions. How do you know when to back off from that kind of externalization of the interior?
Thank you, James. Yeah.
So there's a question from Indra Pamitra. There are two kinds of artists: those who need research, as you cited, Fred Wilson, Mark Dion, and there are many, but there are also artists who do not approach art from an idea or a concept. So far as the affective and the practical aspect of knowledge is concerned, do you feel that they are automatically remain underprivileged?
Yeah, underprivileged. So if you take an average artist who's already a student somewhere, they're already in an institution, they're, if I could coin a really awkward phrase, I would say that what happens is they self-underprivilege themselves. Because to get in that, if you're that kind of an artist, but you're in one of these institutions, you're very likely to have to avoid certain aspects of your practice in order to make other parts visible. So there is this danger of submerging, of having to submerge parts of your practice in order to make in order to create the correct appearance. That's the form of self-underprivileging, or whatever you'd say, self-occlusion that I find, and then I often find myself telling students in institutions when I'm visiting, doing critiques and things like that, I often find myself out of the hearing of the dean saying things you should drop out. you need to find another way to articulate your work in another context.
We have another question by Anand Krishnan. Thank you, Professor Elkins, for the insightful presentation. Does the socio-historical hierarchical structure that defines the role of art and artists, as well as the status of both in our societies, have prejudices about art as knowledge? Is this prejudice restricted to integration of art practice as academic research, or a tool of knowledge production rather than a tool of expression? Who actually wanted the artist to remain as an individual, to express his emotions? Only a world today guided by knowledge economy. I hope I read it correctly. Yeah.
If I'm understanding that correctly, this is also something that varies widely between institutions. There are institutions that are very much invested in the knowledge economy, as I think you said, and there are institutions that are very much aimed at what's useful in capitalist economy, and ways to find employment and things like that, practical, pragmatic things. But then there are others that are resolutely against that. And most of the influential practice-led PhDs make a big point of being more or less disengaged in the name of political and other freedoms, but any number of institutions don't. And I think it might be worth saying, and so I'm not sure if I'm answering your question directly or well at all, but it may be worth saying something that hasn't come up yet, and that is that there's another tradition of practice-led PhDs that has also been going since the 70s, and that's the design PhD. The design PhD is very systematized in terms of research, much more than the practice-led visual art PhD is, and those are also much more instrumentalized, those programs. So by point of comparison, if you wanted, if that's helpful at all.
Yeah.
There is also a question from a PhD student, Sumedha Bhattacharya. Thank you so much, Professor Elkins, for the fun presentation. Really loved it. I just began my practice-led PhD, overwhelming at the moment in a spatial arts and the art and architecture department, thematically understanding the triadic relationship between dance, film, space. Using my embodied knowledge in dance and filmmaking, I am proposing a dance film which includes two spheres of practical bodily knowledge. My aim is to attempt a design-led pedagogy that is informed from the creative process of the camera, body, and space. A lot of thoughts at the moment. You said, but maybe one thing I'm wondering, if what I am doing, could it be a way of approaching knowledge production, as you mentioned, embodied in the artwork?
It sounds that way. I mean, I'd have to see it. I'd have to see it and experience it, but it sounds that way. But I mean, there is a difference, though, between embodied knowledge and embodied practice. I mean, it sounds like your practice, it involves bodies, right? So this is body-centered performance art, to put it in general terms, along with dance and design, other things. So that there's the literal presence of expressive, symbolic, narrative, other bodies in dance, for example. Is different from the claim that that knowledge is embodied, which is only a metaphor in a sense, because it pertains to the materiality of the artwork. So it might be helpful to try to distinguish those two things, because they seem to be both in your work, but I'd have to see it. So
yeah. We have one last question, I guess. Time for, this is a student at the MFA with us who just joined the MFA. Thank you, Professor Elkins, for a spectacular lecture. Deriving from Sumantra sir's question, knowledge we acquired during making an artwork or the artistic process leading. Oh, okay. when making an artwork or artistic process leading to addition in knowledge in a very personal sense, adding to one's own personal pool of knowledge. Could that perhaps also be considered viable form of knowledge along with the other six, or would that be categorized as one of these six? Furthermore, what would be the scope of such knowledge to be universally acknowledged, if at all it needs to be?
I wish I would have to ask. Sorry, I would have to ask another question in response before I could begin to answer that. But it sounds like the question is about knowledge that's produced for the artist in the course of making the artwork and how that might work. If you want, you could ask for it to follow up. But otherwise, I can't quite answer that. Maybe it might be a useful thing to do here to say that I'm always happy to engage in these kind of endless discussions by email as well. Premjish, if you'd like to just give everyone my email, I'm perfectly happy to answer questions like that, which it probably would take, some video attachments and other kinds of information in order to make them answerable.
Yeah.
Professor Rajat is waiting to ask.
Yeah, Rajat is waiting to ask.
You're on mute. You're on mute.
Sorry, James, to come in again. I had a very quick question again, very self-serving. Every field, I'm an economist, I might be sort of rubbing economists the wrong way here. Every field goes through a period of introspection and a crisis of legitimacy, and economics has gone through that, especially after the financial crisis. And tries to reinvent itself, develop new methodologies. As in economics, staying away from math, the increasing mathematical models that have come into economics, and sort of largely irrelevant, as people say, to the real world. So using that sort of construct and conferences such as this we are having within in SNU, and I'm sure there are several of these happening across the world. So is this a manifestation of a crisis of legitimacy within the art-driven world or the practice-driven PhDs, or is this just pushing the boundaries and trying to create new knowledge systems? So, or would you characterize it as a hybrid? But my real question is there a crisis of legitimacy in the field?
Yeah, there is. So in some parts of the world, these PhDs are required. There are, I know of examples, for example, where faculty members in Uganda and other African countries, in Ghana, were asked to leave their posts of instruction and go and obtain PhDs, usually in London, in order to continue teaching. Whereas in other parts of the world, these degrees are basically ignored. In the States, we only have 5 of these PhDs for various reasons that I don't have time to get into. We only have 5 of them. And the result of that is that most people don't know what they are. And therefore, when people with PhDs apply for jobs, for teaching jobs in the States, it often doesn't matter that they have the degree. So it's not so much that there is a group out there that's interested in spending their time criticizing them. I might be the only one. It's not that. It's that they're variably they vary widely in how expected they are in different parts of the world because of the commonness of the degrees themselves. But also, just in relation to what you're saying first there, I said quickly in passing that I think that there are maybe about 6 flavors of these PhDs in different parts of the world. And I just think it's a huge opportunity because you're in a place where you do not have to listen to the EU, the Bologna Accords and all of the rest of that, which remain very influential. And also, guess what? I mean, you're not part of the UK either. They remain the single most influential model. So you're in a position where you can actually create out of whole cloth, if you want, something new. Which would be fascinating, really fascinating to see something like that. And I have an idea that if it's done right, it would easily attract students internationally because it would stand out because people are not doing that kind of thing.
Okay, thanks, James.
Yep.
Reach out to you.
Yeah, Premjish? Okay, I think Premjish is frozen.
No, yeah, I'm here. I was wondering. But it depends on how much time Jim has now.
Yeah. But Jim,
you mean if there's more questions? You mean, or what did you mean?
I think there are not any more questions. I think almost everything is taken up right now. So I think let's conclude, and thanks a lot for the again wonderful insights and perspectives on artistic research and knowledge production. and giving us these categories and helping us to think and also use them for the coming sessions. And we are going to have one very soon after half an hour. So thank you for joining and thank you for taking out your time. And on behalf of the committee, I thank you. And also everyone who joined at 9 a.m. It's like very, very rare to have an artistic community coming up at 9 a.m. and like be punctual and like attending the online talk. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me. It was fun, and just be sure to share my email if anything comes up in the rest of your conference. And hope you have a great conference.
I will do. I'll happily do that.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dame.